Hello, everybody. I'm here with Pastor Jeff Deuble. Pastor Jeff is the author of this book. It's called Christ Before Creeds. It came out pretty recently, I think maybe just a couple months ago, something like that.
Yeah.
And I would say that to summarize, it's about your own faith journey from a Trinitarian to a non-Trinitarian understanding of God and Jesus and the Bible. But it is a very accessible book, I would say. I think you did a really good job of balancing being substantive, but also being available to a wide audience. Sometimes Unitarians can enjoy getting deep down in the weeds, perhaps a little bit overindulgently so. And I think that you did a good job of keeping an audience in mind. So I would really recommend your book kind of as like the best book if I were giving it to just sort of an engaged Christian, but not necessarily someone who has been to seminary or has a PhD, but is curious on the topic. It addresses questions with a level of seriousness and depth, which is appropriate, but not so deep that it loses people. I think you really struck that balance quite well.
Well, yeah, thank you, Sam. That's exactly the audience that I wrote for. And that was exactly the kind of tone in the book that I sought to, sort of have. And it was written for just basically, people who are churchgoers, but they've not done any academic or theological studies, so I'm not trying to assume too much or trying to get too technical, and yet still, address the subject in a way that's going to be helpful and instructive.
Yeah, and it's certainly not boring either. I enjoyed reading it. It's a pretty quick, easy page turner. And I think that you address kind of the different areas, both sort of scriptural concerns, historical concerns, kind of, I guess you could say spiritual kind of and personal devotional concerns, and then kind of like, what does this mean for the church and the life of believers and stuff like that. I think you hit kind of all of those notes, and you do it in a very kind of peaceful and amenable way that I think anyone could find inviting and interesting and engaging.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Sam. That certainly fulfills what I was hoping to achieve. So that's great.
So kind of with that introduction out there, could you tell me a little bit more about your faith background and sort of what was your Christian life growing up, and how did you get to be where you are?
Sure. So, Sam, I grew up in the Churches of Christ in Australia, which I don't think actually aligns exactly with any of the iterations that there may be in the States, but it's a conservative evangelical church that had a very basic, simple approach to the Christian faith. Basically, let's get back to simple, uncluttered Christianity. Let's just take the Bible as our guide. And let's do away with all of the human traditions and overlays that can so easily, sort of crowd that out. And let's just get back to the Bible. Let's get back to the simplicity of what the Christian faith is all about, to a very enthusiastic, devotion to Jesus.
Yeah.
So that was.
So the Churches of Christ it's a very interesting history. I live in Illinois, and there's a decent amount of Churches of Christ in Illinois, sort of like it's like in the 1820s and 1830s, I think, right, that sort of movement takes off. And a lot of them were from sort of the eastern United States and moved to the frontier. And Illinois was the frontier at that point in time. So in central Illinois, there's actually a lot of Church of Christ influence there, because it was sort of a congregating spot. And there are some towns that were even founded by Church of Christ, sort of either missionaries or pioneers, or some combination of those two things. And I think sometimes I think it's a little bit misunderstood, because part of their purpose for Back to Basics was for unifying, right? They weren't trying to create necessarily new church. They were trying to find a common denominator that could help unify all of these denominations that had been going in all these different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. So it did have that very real intention that, when we did get back to just the simple basics, that would be a platform upon which we could appeal to Christians, across the whole spectrum, so that, we could unify on the basics. Yeah.
Yeah. So you grew up in Churches of Christ in Australia. How did you decide to
Yes.
become a pastor?
Okay. So, yeah, interesting question. I grew up in a church where the minister was very keen to get what he saw as, up and coming, aspiring young men into ministry. And I, at the time, was planning to follow my uncle's footsteps and become an architect. And he said to me one day, he said, well, sure, you can become an architect and you can build, bridges or buildings that might last, maybe 50, 100 years or whatever. But wouldn't it be better to be building something that lasts for eternity, to be building the kingdom of God? And that really appealed to me. And I just said, yep, sounds great. I'll go into ministry.
That's a really cool story. So you became a pastor of a church in the Sydney area. So how did you first come across, I guess, a non-Trinitarian understanding of the Bible?
Yeah, well, eventually I came into a church in Sydney. Interesting because, I had grown up, and particularly in college, I'd only ever sort of been taught Trinitarian theology. So I had no other understanding really than a Trinitarian sort of, theological appreciation of who God is and who Jesus is. I just accepted that was the biblical standard. And it's interesting, things that come to mind. I remember early on, I had, a strong Christian say to me in my youth, well, Jesus was human and he was divine. What percentage do you think he was of each? Do you think he was 50-50 or 80-20 or, and I had no idea. And he said, well, the truth is he was 100% human and 100% divine. And, at the time I didn't think, that doesn't make sense, or, well, how does that work? Because he was an authority figure, I just said, yeah, okay. In fact, I even thought that was quite profound at the time. Looking back on it, I see it very differently. But it's interesting, you just grow up, you're taught things and you accept them. And that was the case for me. I didn't have any other understanding than a Trinitarian one. And then I guess the crunch came for me one day, and this is when I was maybe about 48. My brother came to me, and he had also been a minister in Churches of Christ, and said, I need to confess that I'm no longer a Trinitarian. Well, that was out of the blue. I just had no understanding about that. So it was just a total shock for me at the time. And I guess that sort of fight or flight kind of response kicks in. So, mine was initially a very much a fight one. And so, I was...
Especially with your brother.
Yeah, exactly. So, as you can imagine, that brought some very robust, candid conversations. And I trotted out all of my reasons and all of the, verses that I use to back up my belief in the Trinity and in Jesus as being God. And so we had some very robust discussions. And in the midst of that, he was able to kind of give me some information I'd never heard, never been exposed to. And it made me realize that, it's not as simple as I once thought it was. So it began questioning for me. And looking back on it, Brian McLaren has like 4 stages of faith. I don't know whether you're familiar with that.
He's sort of an emergent church kind of guy, right? Brian McLaren?
Yeah, he is. And maybe, would have some, maybe not as accepted by some in even, but I thought his concept was good. And I could actually, looking back, see that actually I followed this path. So he starts off, he's saying the first stage is simplicity, where you simply accept what's being, taught and told to you by authority figures. And then he said there's complexity, where you realize that, you know, life and faith isn't as simple as I once thought, you know, and there was that complexity. I realized, hey, wait a minute, this issue isn't as simple as I thought. There's actually a lot of information here that I had never been privy to. And then he said the third stage is perplexity, where, you know, it begins to create real doubt. And that was happening, not just in terms of this doctrine, but I was thinking, wow, you know, if I've got it wrong, if I've had it wrong about what I've believed about Jesus and what I've been preaching for years, if this isn't what the Bible teaches, you know, and I was so sure of this, it really began to rattle me. It really began to say, well, what can I really be sure of? So I did go through a bit of a crisis in that whole process. But then, of course, it took quite a long time. It took maybe a decade of me just every now and then reading different books, rethinking different issues, to finally get to a place of what he calls harmony, where you know, become settled in what you actually do believe. And there's that whole process of deconstruction and then reconstruction. And I went through all of that over a period of maybe 10 to 12 years.
And so it's one thing to go through that as a layperson. It's another thing to go through that as a pastor or minister. How did that interact with your story?
Yes, well, very interesting. So when I was just in the initial stages of, you know, starting to question things, for example, at our local fraternal, which is the local gathering of ministers in churches, and I actually started that and I facilitated that. And so we had a practice where each time we got together, one of the clergy, one of the members of the fraternal would lead in devotions. And so the Anglican pastor was leading in devotions, and he just made the comment.
So this is a multi or interdenominational fraternal.
Yeah, interdenominational, local fraternal.
That's cool.
And he, in his devotion, just made a comment, you know, Jesus had to be God to die for our sin. And of course, at one stage, I would have just accepted that. But because I was questioning, I said, you know, well, where does it actually say that in the Bible? Where does the Bible actually teach that? It was probably the wrong forum to ask that question. But I mean, there was a confidentiality, you know, I guess, you know, understanding within the fraternal. But I met with that Anglican minister, and he was upset about, you know, what I was thinking and the questions I was asking. So he informed the leader of my denomination that I was heretical.
And had you formally changed your mind on this topic yet, or
No,
were you more in the questioning phase?
Absolutely, very early in the questioning phase, you know, and so I was far from having come to any settled position. But then the word got out, and he spread the word in the, you know, elsewhere, that I had sort of, you know, become unorthodox and a heretic. Our church got blacklisted within, you know, the local area and things like that, even though my own church was totally unaware of this journey that I was on. And I wasn't sharing it generally. I wasn't out there on any crusade. It was a very private journey that I was on. The elders knew that I was on this journey. I told a few of the staff that we brought on, so they were aware and they were not coming on under false pretenses, but I was, you know, a long way from coming to any conclusion. But yeah, it did create some ramifications, to the point where finally the staff, or a few of the staff, initiated a meeting with the denominational leaders to sit down and talk with me and our leaders about what we were going to do about this issue of my unorthodox views. Now, we had this meeting, and I I guess I was so, was it? I was so sort of believing that Churches of Christ, what we stood for was such that we could accommodate this.
Yeah.
But, because I thought, okay, well, this is my journey. And I saw it as a non-essential. Some people
Right.
might see it, but I thought, okay, this is not an essential. And Churches of Christ had this saying: in essentials, unity; non-essentials, liberty; in all things, love.
Right.
And that,
That's sort of a well-known phrase now, but it comes from the Churches of Christ movement.
well, I think we borrowed it from elsewhere,
Oh,
but we
okay.
kind of adopted it as kind of like a core value,
Right.
And
Yeah.
so when we met with the leaders of our network of churches, I thought that the issue would be, is this biblical or not? Because that's the touchstone always for Churches of Christ. Let's get back to the Bible and what the Bible says, not what other people might believe. So, but the issue wasn't, is this what the Bible teaches? And I thought, well, if it's not that, it'll be, is this essential or not? But that wasn't the issue. So it wasn't, is this scriptural or is this essential or not? The issue was, this has the potential to cause reputational damage to our churches. And
right. If you're
therefore,
getting blacklisted or badmouthed or even cast a suspicion upon by other churches in the area, that will affect other things too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And as I said, look, this was my own journey. I wasn't out there preaching it or trying to gather people around. Most people in our church wouldn't have even been aware of it.
Right. And it sounds like you weren't even particularly clear on your alternative yet, but it was a subject that was under investigation by you.
Yeah.
So even the idea that the Trinity was somehow being questioned or thought about or analyzed was the problem, not that you were hammering from the pulpit a clear denouncement of the doctrine or something.
Yeah. I did have a couple of meetings prior to, and I was in that state. But by the time we had this meeting with our church leaders and the leaders of our movement, at that stage, I had actually come to, I guess, that place of harmony, that place where I was in my settled understanding of what the Bible taught. But it was interesting that you say that, Sam, because the principal of our Bible college said to me, he said, well, why don't you just say that you're still on the journey? If you could just say you're still on the journey, then that will be okay. And I said, well, I could say that, but in all honesty and with integrity, yeah, I can no longer say that. And it became clear that this was going to create a real issue for the leaders in our church. And so because I could see that I was the problem here, I decided to step down from leading that church, which I had actually planted 19 years ago, and as a church plant had grown up with, and to quite a significant church.
Yeah, well, that must have been very, I don't know, difficult, heartbreaking, all of those sorts of things. I can only imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, not only did I lose, I guess, my church and my vision and my ministry, but also, any other opportunity to really take on a church in our denomination. Yeah.
And your spiritual community and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. So many deep relationships. Absolutely.
Yeah. This is a pattern that I've seen. Sometimes it feels unfortunate. I don't know. It sometimes seems like among Trinitarians who come to a non-Trinitarian understanding kind of through good faith investigation of the scriptures, that it takes a very honest and good person, I would say, to do that. And then sometimes it seems like that process, then when churches either come to reject that person, excommunicate them, or kind of what happened to you, that it's this really unfortunate thing where we're so compelled to do the right thing that sometimes it seems like man, I wish we would stick to our guns and fight a little bit, but then, you know, that's not necessarily maybe what Jesus would do. And it's only people who really are willing to stick to their guns about following Jesus that will voluntarily go through this sort of process. So it seems like this pattern where the good people do it, and sometimes the not quite as scrupulous people are left on the other side. And that's a frustrating thing that I don't know what the answer to that is, or exactly what point I'm trying to make, but I've seen that happen a lot of times.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the you know, as I said, the president of the Bible College was actually offering me an olive branch and just saying, hey, look, you know, if you'll play along with us, you know, we'll play
tip
with
your hat just a little bit, and I can work with that. Yeah,
that's right. So, you know, they were offering me a way to, in a sense, maybe, you know, compromise or just you know, be diplomatic, and we can work this out in another way. I guess it was just a question of my integrity, you know, and what I could honestly say and do to live with myself. And so, yeah. So it was that,
yeah. So I grew up in a biblical Unitarian church. We actually never used that phrase of ourselves. I actually don't think I knew the word biblical Unitarian until like 4 or 5 years ago. And someone said, I'm like, what is that? And so, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. I know what that means. Okay, yeah, because we just always said, you know, we didn't believe in the Trinity, or we didn't believe Jesus was God, and we didn't have a name for our alternative. But I've kind of rubbed elbows with a lot of Trinitarians, and I actually even currently go to a Trinitarian church and have been involved with evangelical ministries that are of Trinitarian denominations or parachurches, or, you know, etc. And so, you know, sometimes I've gotten in trouble for those sorts of things. But one thing I don't know what it's like to actually be a Trinitarian, because I actually never have. I have a pretty good imagination, I think, for what people are saying. And I totally know when you were talking about when your brother first explained his change of mind to you, that you felt, I don't know, shell-shocked, or this fight or flight response. I've definitely been in your brother's position on that situation numerous times. But yes. I guess one thing that I want to ask you is what is sort of the emotional draw, the spiritual connection, and that Trinitarianism has to offer that kind of gives this response when it's encountered with an alternative idea?
Well, I think most Trinitarians, you know, just believe that you know, what they've been taught is the truth, and you just come up accepting that. You're not even aware there's any other way to see it. You know, so you're just brought up in that paradigm, and you give it. It's interesting. I was in a class about this time last year, and it was a class that was taught by Churches of Christ on the Trinity. And so this 3-day intensive was all about the Trinity, and everyone in the class was Trinitarian theological students except myself. And the lecturer, you know, just was saying things like, well, we know that the early Christians were persecuted in the 1st century, as we see in the book of Acts. And, you know, it was because they believed that Jesus was God that they were receiving this persecution. Now, everyone just sat there and accepted that. And I was there, the only one pushing back and saying, hey, wait a minute, do you have any historical evidence to back up, you know, your contention that this persecution of the early believers, you know, was because of their belief in Jesus as God? I said, Paul says in Galatians that the persecution was because of, you know, how they saw or how they were seen to be in terms of the law. So, you know, a lot of things are just said and accepted unquestioningly. And there's not even any awareness that there's any other way of seeing it. Or if there is another way of seeing it, a bit like, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, or it's a very cultish
it's easily discredited. And in fact, it's almost like the example of Jehovah's Witness and Mormons serves the purpose of showing that, look, some people don't believe it, but look, they're like that, right? So
Yes,
yeah,
yes, exactly.
to
Yeah.
reinforce the kind of the exception, they're the exceptions that prove the rule, I guess, is sort of kind of the purpose that they sometimes hold in popular imagination. But I think that sometimes Trinitarians feel like it would be sort of like taking their Jesus away or something like that. If they
Yes.
were to suddenly believe something different. And I think you said something sort of similar to that in your book. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, I think once again, to see it any other way is to kind of it's to question all of your authority structures, that you've established, but also it's to discredit the people, who you've respected as you've grown up and all those kind of things. But there is also a very strong sense, and I felt it very much as well, that if you don't see Jesus as God, then you're diminishing him, that you're taking away from who he is. And there's that strong sense of that as well.
It would
I
be
had that.
disrespectful or even disloyal or something.
Yeah, it's to diminish him. That's how I saw it when my brother started to talk. When he said, "Well, Jesus is the son, is the Son of God, but he's not God the Son," I felt sick inside. I thought he was, taking my Jesus and bringing him down. And I think that's a strong sense of it all too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that almost seems part of it. Like non-Trinitarians, in my experience, often treat Trinitarians with more understanding than vice versa. And I think that non-Trinitarians, it's like, okay, we understand what you Trinitarians are saying, and maybe there's even like a good intention behind it of making sure that Jesus is given all the sort of glory and honor and respect that would be due to him, but you're like going too far, right? And that doesn't seem perhaps as drastic of a mistake as not going far enough. And that is part of the asymmetry of how the two groups can sometimes see and treat each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good comment. Yeah, Sam, I think that's often the case. Absolutely.
And then a common question or a common complaint that comes up nearly right away is, and you sort of mentioned this when you were in the meeting with the other pastors, is, well, wouldn't Jesus need to be God to do X? And oftentimes it's to die for our sins, but it could also sometimes it's to do miracles or to to be our Lord and Savior, or you fill in the blank, but that Jesus needs to be God in order for all of these other important things to also be true, right?
Yes.
And there, I kind of understand the intuition behind that, but I guess I've never thought that from the inside. So what's that like, and how is it like for you to kind of, I guess, see beyond that sort of paradigm?
Well, what was really helpful for me, Sam, was when my brother started to talk to me and I began to read about the whole Jewish understanding of agency. I had never even come across that. And I think that's the problem, is that oftentimes we or Christians approach the Bible with, their predetermined assumptions. So they bring a Trinitarian assumption to the Bible that Jesus is God, and therefore they read that back into the scriptures. And that's very easy to do. But when you begin to understand the Jewish mindset in things like agency, particularly, and in other things, you begin to get a different perspective. That Jesus is the divinely appointed, authorized agent of God, who comes in a sense as God, but not himself God. So he represents and is the agent of God without himself being God. And it's just sort of coming to terms with some of those things, I think, is helpful. So having a Jewish understanding and trying to bring that, and that's what I try to do in the book. I try to sort of say, hey, look, rather than a Greek philosophical perspective that we tend to naturally bring, let's get back to how the original authors would have seen things and understood things, and come from their worldview.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that idea of agency, that it would that can get past that idea that, well, Jesus needs to be God in order for what he accomplishes to work or matter or to count or something like that. And an example I often bring up is, it's like, well, so who brought the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt? Did God bring the Hebrews out of slavery, or did Moses? Right. And then that sort of starts to get under that idea. Well, then, okay, so who is saving us from our sins, God or Jesus? Right. And then that kind of, that distinction and connection then starts to click in that kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you start reading the Gospels, you realize that Jesus was saying exactly that. He basically says, look, the words that I bring, the works that I do, they're not mine. They're my Father working in me and through me. And Peter on the day of Pentecost, that Jesus was a man, attested by God through, what he did. And when you start to read it from that different understanding and perspective, it all just starts to make a lot more sense and read a lot more cogently and coherently.
Yeah, and naturally. So we talked a little bit about sort of kind of, I guess, the spiritual intuitions and feelings that can help make Trinitarianism feel attractive, or at least kind of hard to leave. That sense that Jesus is just sort of God himself, kind of is this connection between what Jesus did and why it would matter in sort of a spiritual level or a spiritual plane. But what are some, I think that biblical Unitarians need to be a little bit better at telling our story in a way that is not just sort of logical and coherent, which it is, and not just sort of is more faithful to the Bible, which it is, but is also sort of emotionally attractive and spiritually attractive, and sort of commanding people's, spiritual affections, or however you would want to put that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it is important that we, have our understanding as to what we believe and why we believe it, but then also to be able to, I guess, indicate, just the amazing Jesus as a man, that he was able to, resist temptation, that he was able to put his faith in God. I mean, if he was already God, if he'd already, been in heaven before his birth, he did, as the Bible says, you don't need faith. Faith is where you don't have sight. So faith only really makes sense in a non-trinitarian understanding of Jesus.
Right.
And
to have the faith. Yeah, you talk about the faith of Jesus, right? And we have faith in Jesus too. We're not saying that we shouldn't have faith in Jesus. When I go to the doctor, I have faith in my doctor that he'll treat me. When I go to the dentist, I have faith that they will take good care of my teeth and not try and scam me out of too much money. We have faith in people all the time. And I'm not saying that our faith in Jesus is at the same level as our faith in the dentist. It's obviously much bigger than that. But there's also the faith of Jesus, that Jesus, he goes to the cross trusting in God, right? That God will raise him from the dead, right? That this is what God has asked him to do. And he's trusting in God. He's not just God going through the motions, knowing perfectly well in his omniscience that everything's going to be well the whole time. He is a man like us that has to trust in God. And that when we think about that, then we can realize that Jesus isn't just someone to have faith in, but it's someone who we emulate the faith of. And if Jesus just is God, it seems to break that link. And I think that's really one of the important ideas that a non-Trinitarian understanding of Jesus has to offer.
Absolutely, yeah. So his faith, his hope, all those kind of things make a whole lot more sense. His trust in God, his absolute reliance on God in every aspect of his life. His resisting temptation. I mean, I guess I had this fear that if I didn't have this Trinitarian faith in Jesus, if I saw him as a member of the human race, as a man, that would somehow, sort of weaken my admiration or love or devotion. It's actually increased it. It's actually strengthened it. I actually now appreciate Jesus more than I ever have. So those fears I had that it would affect my devotion and love for Jesus were totally unfounded. Really, I've come to appreciate him more deeply and more wonderfully than I ever have.
Yeah. One thing that you talked about a little bit earlier is that a challenging thing that can happen is, as someone moves from Trinitarianism to non-Trinitarianism, even if they sort of get this idea that we were just talking about, that suddenly Jesus actually seems to come to life in a way, instead of just being like a Superman sort of avatar. You use the example of Superman in your book. But there is this distrust that happens. Well, wait a minute. How did I believe something so wrong? How was I taught something so wrong? Why didn't anybody tell me about this? And that I have seen some, not a ton, but some examples where people move from Trinitarianism to non-Trinitarianism. And this sort of, I don't know who I can trust anymore, either sends them into kind of a weird sort of lonely isolation, is one thing that can happen, or they just continue to deconstruct and be like, well, maybe the whole religion was a hoax this whole time, and they go into either atheism or just sort of, non-belief. Or one third option that I've seen is to go to either Catholicism or Orthodoxy and be like, well, maybe this Protestantism thing, I'm just going to find the institution that I can trust and just fully trust them, and not, and maybe the problem is just me, right? And that I'm just going to fully, go to one of those churches who tells me exactly what to believe and is a institution that has a very kind of, strict guideline on these sorts of things. That I've seen all three of those sort of reactions to this, because it's a tough pill to swallow, to realize that something that was held up as so important could be so wrong. And then how do I rebuild a trust in a church or institutions or history or any of those sorts of things again? So what was that process like for you, and how have you sort of held on to some amount of, I don't know, hope and positive feeling after swallowing a relatively hard medicine?
Yeah, well put, Sam. And I think you're expressing there something of, those stages of faith that people, after complexity, often get to perplexity, where doubt and skepticism and those kind of things can easily creep in, and it will produce either a response where it's all too hard, so I'll just escape back to simplicity, to something that's concrete, or it can mean, as you say, that it just unravels and they just lose faith in in everything, be it the Christian faith, or be it Trinitarianism or non-Trinitarianism. So it's a matter of saying, okay, well, maybe what I taught wasn't right, but that doesn't mean I have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is everything wrong, or is it just some things that need to be rethought and reworked? And I guess that was the thing. I was saying, okay, well, let's get back and see what is true here and what's solid, and then going from that basis to reconstruct. So rather than continue to deconstruct, well, what can we build out of what is solid, and go from there.
Yeah. So I think that, kind of building off that last question, is that for non-Trinitarians, there's kind of two choices for us in terms of how to kind of go to church and have community and fellowship and those sorts of things. And it's either to kind of go into, Trinitarian churches with probably some level of acceptance, but also some level of restriction, right? Where it's like, okay, you can show up on Sunday, you can't become a member because you can't say the statement of faith. And if you're not a member, you can't vote, you can't do, I don't know, but Sunday school, etc. But you can participate to some half measure, right? But at least I'm getting something rather than nothing. And then who knows, maybe my presence over time will open up their mind to these sorts of questions also. That that's a hope that often isn't realized. And then the other option is to try and build our own, new churches, new institutions, new fellowships, maybe home fellowships and stuff like that. But that's you're a church planner, you know how difficult it is to build new things. So what's sort of your opinion on, should non-Trinitarians kind of stay in Trinitarian land with some sort of hope of our example and witness bearing some fruit, or should we focus more on building our own churches and our own institutions where we can have full acceptance?
Yeah, once again, good question, Sam. I think my response would be that it would be very much situationally determined. I'd hate to have a rule that sort of is a blanket rule. I think it would be, determined by the response or the culture of the church that you're involved in. You get churches that are very accepting, and others that are very, strict. And, I guess it's a matter of, as you're involved in that church, is it something that is helpful for you, and is it helpful for the people? Or do I have to compromise too much, one way, or am I causing too much angst? So basically, what are the benefits of my being here for myself and for this fellowship? Is that okay or not okay? And it will depend a little bit just on attitudes and what the culture of the church is, really. Sometimes to keep in that situation will so grieve your spirit, or cause so much angst in the people around you, that it's not worth continuing. In that. I'd still be saying, a bit like Paul. He used to go to the Jewish synagogues, and he would proclaim this new understanding of Jesus, which and of the gospel, which met varying responses. There were churches like the Bereans who, were very honorable and judged everything by the scriptures. And there were other situations that were much more antagonistic. So I'd probably gauge it, maybe situationally, but I can see there is some value in non-Trinitarians getting together, maybe to produce, situations or resources that would encourage people who otherwise are not going to be encouraged in their journey. Yeah. So I can see some advantage there.
Yeah. So how should, what advice would you give to non-Trinitarians who are looking to build either a church or a fellowship or some kind of institutions of their own, as someone who has planted churches?
Okay, yeah. So I guess for me, it's certainly understanding what you believe and why you believe it. But then for me, as I try to say in the book, it's a matter of putting that in perspective. Because there are a lot of, institutions, even political parties, that are kind of one-issue parties, and they so obsess and fixate on that they lose perspective across the board. And so I'd say, okay, yes, we need to understand what we believe, why we believe it. We need to keep that in perspective. And from my background as a Church of Christ, I see this as a non-essential. Others don't, but as I read the scriptures, I think that, whether a Christian believes, has a high Christology because they believe Jesus is God, or they have a high Christology because they believe, that he is an exalted man, either way, he is Lord, and they are putting their trust in him and what he's achieved on the cross. All those basics are still there, whatever. So you just need to kind of, I think, keep it in perspective. And I think you need to also see that that they're our brothers and sisters. You know, they're not the enemy.
Yeah.
And to kind of have an accepting attitude, and then to have patience. I mean, I think it's just important. It took me about 10 or 12 years, that whole journey from being committed Trinitarian to committed non-Trinitarian. And it takes people oftentimes, even with the gospel, you're not going to kind of convert them in one presentation. You know, you'll sow a seed here, sow a seed there. God's Spirit will begin to work on those seeds. It takes time, you know, and I think we just need to keep all of those things in mind, you know, whatever we do as non-Trinitarians.
Mm-hmm. And so a question that I'm kind of curious about is, statements of faith are often, creeds or statements of faith are often one of the things that keeps us non-Trinitarians excluded from Trinitarian churches and institutions. Should non-Trinitarian churches have their own statements of faith and creeds, or is it creeds that are kind of the problem themselves?
Yeah, well, I come, of course, from a non-creedal background, Churches of Christ, you know, no creed but Christ. And that's where the title of my book sort of fits in. So I'm very non-creedal. Not that I'm saying statements of faith are necessarily wrong in themselves, but when they become prescriptive, I think that's when it's wrong. You know, it's okay if they're descriptive, saying, you know, these, you know, are things that we believe in. But when we get to cross the line and say, well, you have to believe these things, then when they become prescriptive, not just descriptive. So I'm happy for creeds if there's some sort of, you know, statement that says that this is what, you know, is generally, or this is what are the things that we hold and value together. You know, so I'm happy about that. And but I would be a little resistant to creeds. I tend to be one more for like underlying principles or core values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, Sam, there's a interesting thing. Do you know about bounded sets and centered sets?
Yes, I've heard that description, that terminology before. I was once part of a group that claimed that it was a centered set until they found I was out of bounds. But so part of me is a little skeptical when I hear that. I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure you actually believe that? Because I will put that to the test in my person. So part of me has a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth, but I have heard that before. So yeah, could you explain a little bit more about that distinction?
Yeah, sure. So a bounded set, it'd be good if I had, you know, paper and pen, but a bounded set is when you have a boundary. And basically you define people as in or out, acceptable or unacceptable, based on whether they fulfill the criteria that means that they're inside the boundary. So in Australia, we have, you know, think of a herd of goats or sheep or something. You can put a fence around and keep them in and say, okay, well, if they're in there, they're in. If they're outside, they're out. And a lot of churches, you know, like Anglicans have their 39 articles, and, you know, these are the things you have to believe. And if you tick these boxes, then you're in the boundary. The other approach is, in Australia, we have like huge, you know, sort of stations that are just, you know, thousands of square kilometers or square miles. So you can't build fences, but you have watering holes. And so the cattle are free to roam, but they're attracted. You don't
have to worry about them going too far, because there's a magnet and a attractor that sort of keeps that gives the group coherence without there needing to be a boundary.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah, so you define people not by a boundary, but where they are in relationship to the center, and whether what direction they're going. Are they going towards or away from, you know? And I think that's much more dynamic, much more relational. And for me, I like that understanding of the Christian faith, that, you know, that Jesus is, you know, the center, that God is, you know, the one who draws us, and relationally we are connected to him and therefore to each other. We don't need these strict boundaries to keep people in place. I like that. I think that
one of the things that non-Trinitarians who have either changed their mind from Trinitarianism to non-Trinitarianism, or people like me who have just butted up against too many boundaries, that one thing that we learn is that those boundaries can often be very impersonal and sort of cold-hearted, and they just don't have the feel of the Spirit of God about them, in the way that they get enforced. Or, because I think we've probably both experienced people who are kind of zealous to enforce those boundaries in a way that doesn't seem very Christ-like, or people who are part of an institution where they feel obligated to do something, even though they might not feel like it's the right thing to do. Like, I'm sure that there was a lot of people in your congregation or in your denomination that liked Jeff, but they felt this kind of weird external pressure, either from, history or tradition or their institution, to do something. And it can feel very un-Christ-like, and doesn't seem to be an example of the fruit of the Spirit or the gospel in their life, and whether they're doing it kind of voluntarily and zealously or not.
Mm. And once again, it's getting back to what is Christianity all about? I think, the religious approach is, that you've got to tick these boxes and fulfill these requirements in order to, conform and be acceptable. Whereas, Jesus butted up against the religious leaders of his day because his approach was so different. His was, you worship God, with your lips, you've got the outward form, but your hearts are far from him. And of course, their response to Jesus, reflected their heart to God, and their hearts were a long way from where they needed to be, even though they had all the rules and the regulations in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that the kind of creeds or, long statements of faith or articles of faith can become, even though it seems like it's faith as opposed to works, right? It's like, oh, that, works is, doing, I guess, activities that check boxes. And now I have faith over here and I'm checking boxes of faith, but it can become a weird sort of, I don't know, propositional Pharisaicalism or something like that, in a way that isn't capturing kind of the heart of faith itself either.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, indeed. So a lot more could be said about that too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess, do you have any sort of closing thoughts or things that concluding remarks that you want to say?
No, just thanks very much, Sam. I appreciate your endorsement. I've really enjoyed just this conversation and coming across people like you who I think and I try to do this in the book, that hold truth and grace together. And as Paul says about controversial issues like this, he says, his issue was food sacrificed to idols. And of course, there were people who had different views around that. He said, look, we all have knowledge, but knowledge puffs up, love builds up. And if it's just a matter of, we've got to get the right doctrine here without a heart of love for God and for others, then I think we've missed the boat. And, just talking to you, I really appreciate not just, what you believe, but I appreciate, your attitude and your heart in all you believe as well.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate that. And I really enjoyed your book, and I would heartily recommend it to anyone. And it might even be a good idea for non-Trinitarians to keep it stocked in case they run into a situation where they need to give a good example of what they believe to someone who's asking questions or confused or what have you. So so buy the book, and maybe more than one. You never know when it might come in handy.
Yeah, it was interesting on that one, Sam. I see it as really an introductory book that helps people to get on the journey, helps them kind of, start the journey of discovery. But it's interesting, I've had more people than I would have thought, even, church pastors who've read the book, and from being, fully Trinitarian, they've now come to position of non-Trinitarian, having just read that book. I just thought it will help people get on the journey, but for some, they've been so convinced it's actually taken them all the way. So yeah.
Yeah, we never know what effect our work will have, and ultimately it's in God's hands, and God often accomplishes more with our what can seem like our mediocre work than we ever thought possible.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Well,
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Sam. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate it.